Well, I see that some people were taking pictures, so if some of you can email me some of those, because I want to show my graduate students who am I hanging out with. Uh,
We will have
Your
the
wife too.
professional photographer
Yes.
bringing for everyone.
So, of course, 2016, we will celebrate the centennial of Claude Shannon. And one of the things we are planning is a film, a documentary, that will be shown hopefully in public television, Nova, BBC, and so on. We have lined up a very good filmmaker, and I personally going to be involved in the next few months in this project quite heavily. We're now at the very beginning of the fundraising stage of the project. So, this is something that we're going to put a lot of effort, and hopefully it will be done by the end of 2016. All right, so what I wanted to talk about really is Claude Shannon, not surprisingly. So, of course, many things to say about Claude, but you all know about his successes and his contributions and so on. So, what I wanted to say is more, I wanted to discuss more his personal life, and also not just the good side, but also, he was a human being and he went through hardship in his life. So let me give you a few vignettes. Claude, after he left Michigan, after his undergraduate, he really had a very little contact with his mother. His father was older when he died. He had already passed away, and he really had very little contact with his mother. His great stroke of luck, of course, was that he was hired by Vannevar Bush to take care of the differential analyzer at MIT while he was pursuing his graduate studies. His master's thesis was an instant hit. The differential analyzer had a logic side and an analog side. The master's thesis was on the logic side. He also wrote a paper on the analog side, and in his words, that paper fled as a lead balloon. But the master's thesis got this Alfred Nobel Prize, was featured in the New York Times, and so on. His PhD thesis, in fact, on an algebra for theoretical genetics, that he wrote essentially in one summer. Vannevar Bush knew this woman, Barbara Burks, in the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in Long Island. And Barbara, in fact, committed suicide not long after. She was a young woman, brilliant woman in genetics. She jumped from the George Washington Bridge. Then at MIT, he had to pass a foreign language exam to get his PhD. And surprisingly, he chose French, even though his mother was a German teacher in high school. And then he hired a young instructor, a Jewish woman by the name of Norma Livor, to tutor him. She had immigrated from Europe. This was 1939, so you can imagine the winds of war were already blowing. And as he put it in a letter to Vannevar Bush, they started with French, and one thing led to another, and finally they got married. So they moved to Princeton because Claude had an appointment at the Institute for Advanced Study as a postdoctoral fellow. And that was a very tough time. Claude was very reclusive. He was barely showing up at the institute. Essentially, he was spending his whole time at home playing the clarinet. And Norma was very unhappy to the point that one day she couldn't take it anymore, and she went to Princeton Junction, took the train to New York, and that was it. So he actually dropped out from the Institute for Advanced Study, stayed in Princeton, but working for what was the precursor of NSF, and they were doing work related to the war effort. Then he was hired by Bell Labs, and he was living in the East Village. And this was like a townhouse of apartments. And there was this young woman, 17, 18 years old, Maria Moulton, and she had come from Belgium, also a Jewish refugee. And the superintendent of the building told her, there's this young man. Claude by then was about 26 years old. He's always alone. Maybe you should, do something with him and go out with him or something. And then they became, boyfriend, girlfriend. And in fact, she's still alive. I'm still in contact with her. And she wrote an autobiography. In fact, Norma, Shannon's first wife, also wrote an autobiography. She ended up being part of the Hollywood crowd, married a screenwriter, and so on. So, Claude was Maria's love of her life. She's still in love with Claude, even though she had 2 marriages and children and so on. Now, Claude, at that time, was seeing a famous psychoanalyst in New York. And he told Maria, after he finished his treatment, he told Maria, I finally taught this man how to think. Again, this was an unhappy period in Claude's life. He was working at night, was working all the time at night. Something that had not to do with what he was doing at Bell Labs. You can imagine what that something was. He had, in fact, started working on information theory in Princeton. That's when his first ideas about entropy and so on. But of course, you can imagine that the 1948 paper was not written in 1 or 2 years. It was the product of a very long gestation. But he really hated to go to work at Bell Labs. So Maria literally had to drag him to work, and many times that would not happen until 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So, interestingly, Maria found out that Claude had been married because one day she was cleaning the apartment and somehow came across the divorce papers. He never discussed with her the fact that, she was Jewish, that, the plight of the Jewish people in Europe and so on. This is something that never came up. Now, in the 1940s, he was, as I was saying, he was doing a lot of work for fire control, kind of like Wiener body type of stuff, analog stuff. But in the meantime, he also wrote some gems like the PCM papers, the cryptography, mathematical theory of cryptography, and so on. But then, of course, 1948 comes. His paper is an instant success. In December of 1948, he meets a young mathematician at Bell Labs, Betty Moore, and 3 months later, they are already married. And that really starts what I think is the happiest period, the happiest decade of his life. After that, he was at the top of his game. He was writing amazing papers in the 1950s. So that's really his golden decade, I think. Extremely prolific. I mean, it's not just the things that we all know, all the papers that we all know, but also he was extremely active in what we would call now artificial intelligence, in programming computers to, to play chess, for example, and so on. Then, around 1957, he had this offer from MIT, and finally, he accepted it. In his resignation letter to Hendrik Bode, who was his boss at Bell Labs, says that he's really keen on teaching, but he says, I don't know, maybe the novelty is going to wear off pretty soon. And indeed, after he joined MIT, he didn't publish much, really. I mean, he published the paper that formalized rate distortion theory. He anticipated the main results in the 1948 paper, but he really didn't supply proofs. He wrote the paper on the two-way channel, the birth of multi-user information theory, and then Shannon, Gallagher, and Berlekamp in the 1960s. But really, at some point, he lost interest, and he was really only, he was in his mid-40s. And at that point, he just, became interested in building gadgets at home, in juggling. And at some point, one of his best friends was Bernie Oliver. And he said that he had visited the Shannons in their home, and it was very sad because he said Claude spends his days drinking beer, watching TV. It's really, really sad. And, he really aged prematurely. You can see the pictures from that time, from the early 70s. And as Dave was saying, 1973, a man that was just, 47 years old was already, in his, in a situation that, whether it was the prelude to the illness that finally, the end, that was his end or not, that we don't know. But there's a big mystery of what happened there, why Claude disappeared from the scene. Anyway, so I think I've said enough. Let me just conclude by saying that today is a very important day, not only because it's Claude Shannon's 99th birthday. Carl Friedrich Gauss also was born April 30th, 1777. And finally, let me say that I'm very, very happy to be in the capital of Israel today, because today we celebrate the death of the worst criminal in history, the 70th anniversary of the worst criminal in history. And I always tell my friends as a joke, the worst person in the history of the world died the same day that the best person in the history of the world was born.
Well, Tony purposely led us to believe that there would be no organization of this panel, and he was right. So each of us had his own perspective. So let me just start out by saying that following on what Sergio just said, it's really gratifying to be here, to be with so many old colleagues, old in various senses, and some that are not as old, and a lot of young people, and that you all came to Jerusalem, which if you read the newspapers, especially the New York Times, seems like such a dangerous place, but isn't. And I'm led to remember that I spent many very happy periods, particularly in Haifa, at Technion over the years. One of my most productive times was in 1967, at 6 months after the Six-Day War. And the one thing I really regret was not getting to Ashkelon, which has been often mentioned, and I guess most of the people here were, but I couldn't afford it. I just moved from the cocoon of academia, UCLA, to a somewhat irrational startup, Linkabit, and we were building a house, and it was just a little too much. So I missed the first Shannon lecture, and regretfully, my contact with Shannon was only very briefly twice, so I appreciate the long history that Sergio has given us. So my perspective on what to say is more from the application point of view, because that's really what I've done pretty much my whole career. I had the very good fortune in 1957 to land at JPL just 3 months before Sputnik was launched and the space age was born. That led to what I consider the first real application of information theory. Until that time, and information theory, as we've seen here and continue to see, has many, many ramifications. But the one that I was most interested in was channel coding. And until that time, it seemed to me that it was a solution in search of a problem. They kept defining new channels, which were not all that useful. But suddenly, the space channel provided the opportunity of something that was really necessary and an almost perfect model. It was Gaussian noise, and it was a situation where if you could gain a few dB, you were a hero, because 6 dB meant that you could double the range or reduce the launch weight by reducing the transmitter power, or not building a bigger antenna. In those days, antennas were getting up to something like 210 feet, about 70 meters. So you couldn't go much further than that. So getting a few dB was very important. And starting in the 60s, started using orthogonal coding, some BCH Golay codes, and then finally convolutional codes, which led, I think for the first time, to really employing soft decision decoding, which again picked up the dB that algebraic coding normally would not have given you in those days. So with all that, that gave it a start. Eventually, turbo codes and LDPC came along, or were rediscovered. And this is a very interesting story, one that Bob is too modest to say. But in his doctoral thesis in 1963, he had already defined LDPC codes, had shown that they would converge, the decoding algorithms, but nobody paid any attention. Why not? Because A, the computing power was not sufficient to provide a proper evaluation, and B, even if it had, we didn't have the implementation technology to make use of it. So it took some 30, at least on the order of 30 years to finally make it, and then LDPC became the coding of choice, particularly for large data blocks. Continuing with the application, those first few decades, it was all space and military. The technology, the implementation was just too expensive for anything else. And also, the perspective was kind of wrong for commercial applications. We were very power limited, but we had lots and lots of bandwidth because nobody else was there. So we could go in that direction. For commercial applications, bandwidth becomes more precious, and therefore, and the first application that really came along was direct broadcast satellites, a little bit for the transportation industry, and ultimately trellis-coded modulation that was just mentioned by Bob, and was Ungerbeck and Forney and others, became the way of making use of being efficient in bandwidth and still getting as much as we could out of the Shannon theory. Finally, let me make a few comments about spread spectrum multiple access. That came out again of military work. Actually, it preceded information theory by at least a decade. If you look at what has now become a very popular story, that of Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil, and the the patents that they got in the late 30s for frequency hopping spread spectrum. That really was an information theory, but what did have the flavor of information theory is what happened later in the 50s and 60s, namely direct sequence spread spectrum, or sometimes called CDMA. Now that again came out of the military initially for anti-jam, and it was a very elegant way of doing things. Randomize a signal, which is something that information theory has taught us, make it look more like noise, and that to begin with will fool the enemy. And if he tries to jam it, he will effectively be turned into, in the despreading, the signal comes back to its original form, and the jammer becomes a random signal, a random noise, which is essentially a mini-max solution to the problem. This, which began, as I said, for a purpose of anti-jam, has been later applied for multiple access communication, because being able to overcome one large